Good afternoon and welcome to today's Global Fleet Champions webinar. In case you haven't heard of us before, Global Fleet Champions is a partnership campaign administered by Brake, the road safety charity, to prevent deaths, injuries and pollution caused by vehicles driven for work. To learn more about the campaign and what we do, visit globalfleetchampions.org. Today's webinar focuses on running data-based investigations. The speakers today will cover what data you need to capture from road incidents and how you can best use it to improve the safety of your fleet. We will discuss what information must be collected after a crash, methods for gathering key incident data, how to analyse collision data, and integrating collision data and lessons learned into your road safety policies to minimise future risk. Please be aware that today's webinar is being recorded and the full file will be made available on the Global Fleet Champions website and on Brake's YouTube channel in the days coming after the event, in case you wish to view it again. In a minute, you should see a word cloud question poll appear on your screen so we can find out your views about this subject. As anonymous, simply fill in your answer and press confirm, and we will discuss the results at the beginning of the Q&A session, which should be your opportunity to put your question to today's speakers. You can submit a question at any time during the webinar by using the chat box on Microsoft Teams. The word cloud question will appear on your screen shortly. You will have approximately a minute to fill it in, and the webinar will then begin. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of webinars on incident analysis from Global Fleet Champions. Today's session is all about effective use of data. And I think when we look through the three presentations today, you'll see different aspects of data, how well it can be used, how badly it can be used, and the potential consequences if we don't learn our lessons from it. Just so you get an idea of where I'm coming from, I'm a collision investigator, have been for 21 years now, dealt with over 40,000 collisions, so I've analysed quite a bit of data during that time, and hopefully I've helped a number of operators and employers improve their operations through the effective use of data. So what I want to do today really is to set the scene, and I'm going to start with a video. Just a little background to this video. There are 5 very short clips. They cover a 7-week period, but they also involved the same driver for all 5 incidents. So there's no sound to the video. I'll just give a little bit of commentary to each one so we get an understanding of what's happened. So driver takes the corner too harshly, sets off the G sensor, and now the email has landed on the transport manager's desk advising him of the incident. Common one for those of us living in rural locations, working in rural locations. But again, watch how fast the driver starts to reverse and the speed he gets up to. And by now, this incident's already landed on the transport manager's desk. So a bit of a different one, but this one in particular, because of the harsh braking, sends the trigger and lands on the transport manager's desk. Nothing too untoward, you think on this one, but he raises onto the curb, and that again sends the clip to the transport manager, all resulting in this incident. Fortunately, nobody else involved, and that's probably the main positive we can take out of those 5 clips. So what we have, 1 driver, 5 incidents, 7-week period, maybe 1 transport manager. But what this shows is data, analysing data is not all about the technology. So we know the driver has been incorrect in the way that he drives, has a total lack of regard for safety, and is failure to follow the company policies. But the transport manager is the person managing the data. He's failed to investigate each incident as it's landed in his inbox through the triggers from the telematics system. Not looked at them because there's no other parties involved, so we're not learning from it. Doesn't act on the data and the information available. Again, he's distracted the driver, and again, this is data because he was on the mobile phone to the driver at the time of the incident. moaning about or complaining to the driver that he was running late for his deliveries that day. And he's not implemented the policies and implemented proactive interventions that we can learn from the data. And again, there's company issues, as we highlighted at the bottom of the screen, to make sure that they put safety first and foremost, and that the data is being implemented properly and the policy is updated accordingly. Well, this just goes to show when we talk in this day and age of data, most people just think of data as being what we get from technology, what the vehicle tells us, but we learn as much from speaking to the driver and the transport manager. That is also data that needs to be analysed as we go through the investigation process. So why do we need to analyse everything that's going on within our organisation or our fleet operation? These are some of the types of incidents that are the most common for me that I've dealt with over the last 21 years. And some major ones in particular, those of us who are commercial vehicle operators, roadworthiness prohibition, PG9 notices being given out, why is the vehicle going out incorrectly and maybe unroadworthy, bridge strikes, but vehicle rollovers, rollaways, all potentially serious incidents and fatal incidents that are out there that are happening on our roads every day. But what are we learning from these investigations about these types of incidents, and how are we analysing the data to improve our operations? And these incidents need investigating regardless of how minor they are, whether somebody is at fault or non-fault from a claims perspective, and whether somebody is injured or not. Because those of you who have heard me speak over the years will be quite clear in my thought, and probably this backs up a lot of the things that Global Fleet Champions have been saying for a number of years now. It's not necessarily the collision or the main incident that we learn most things from. It's the information we gather from the incidents we investigate that are classed as near misses by some, or near hits by another, or just classed as an incident because no other party is involved. Those that we class as more minor incidents are the ones that we gain most information from because we identify trends that are starting to develop. And that is the analysis of data that we need to be looking at on an ongoing basis throughout our operations on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, yearly, to make sure we're right up to date with what's going on with our operation. So really, the data analysis is your problem identifier, because it's showing what areas need looking at, and is also the solution provider. They tell us what solutions we need to look for. But unfortunately, we've got to work on those solutions to identify the right people, whether it's internally or externally, to come and provide the right interventions, the right training courses, whether that's for the driver, whether that's for the manager, or whether that's a whole audit process for the organisation to identify what is going on, and to put those recommendations in place that are easily manageable, but have a strategic process over maybe a 2 or 3 year period, because we can't change things overnight from the data that we have, because there's so much of it. And I think that is the biggest problem that we have for people who particularly deal with telematics on a daily basis. There's so much data out there that it's very difficult to manage on top of our normal day-to-day duties. But once we have that data, once it lands on our computer or on the server where it's being stored, we are deemed to know about it. So ignorance is no defence when we look at these things going forward. And I'm sure Charlotte Lemaire in the last session on this webinar will go into a little more detail about how important it is from a legal perspective and what the pitfalls may be if we don't manage our data properly from a legal angle. But just to sort of summarise over the next couple of slides, the data underpins our company safety culture. The analysis drives the fleet strategy. The investigations provide unlimited amounts of data, and the analysis provides a vital part of any fleet strategy. What do we learn? Well, it provides evidence-based corroborative information to confirm good current practices, because a lot of the things we do on a daily basis are good practice, but as well it identifies areas for improvement, remedial actions to reduce future exposure, and targeted training for drivers and managers. And I think that's something we shouldn't underestimate here, is that I've seen through numerous investigations for companies and operators over the years that the recommendations at the end of the internal investigation tends to be aimed at the driver, because the manager's doing the investigation and they are not identifying their own shortcomings in a lot of the investigations they conduct. But most importantly, the data analysis will stress test every company policy to see how it would stand up to scrutiny if the worst case happens, which Charlotte will go into in the last presentation today. So just to summarise my short session, the things on the screen are all there for the basics of what we need to do with data analysis and why it's so important to deal with it on an ongoing basis and not just on a periodic basis or when we've got time to look at it this week or next week or the week after. So I'd just like to thank you for joining this session with me this afternoon. If you've got any questions, put them into the chat box and we will answer them at the end of the session. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrew Barrett-Clough and I'm the VP for Insurance here at eDriving. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about the challenges of collecting data post-collision and taking you through a few ideas that we work with to help clients on that space. So eDriving is focused on reducing driver risk, so making drivers safer and creating a crash-free culture. So that's what we're all about. But obviously we recognise that you can never always completely reduce the risk to a crash. So the question is, what do we do in the instance of that? So in terms of the eDriving proposition, we work with clients across the commercial line spectrum, and you can see here we focus on crash-free culture, so training, analytics and coaching. Mentor, which is our telematics app, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and also virtual risk manager, so the way that we can pull all the data together and enable us to view that, which again I'm gonna talk about the importance of doing that. So as an organization running a fleet, it's obviously a challenge, particularly if it's a large fleet, to really collect that collision data, understand why those collisions happen, and then potentially work on what to do about it afterwards. So what you see on the screen now is really just a representation of the fact that you've probably got multiple data sources, be that external and internal, probably a lot of different stakeholders who are interested in, you know, what's happening with that data, why are we having these crashes, and what are they costing us. So what you'll see here is two of the key primary sources would be insurers and leasing companies. So often you'll be required to submit data to those companies, or you may be able to even request data in the other direction. But really, it's about making sure that you've got the maximum amount of important data. So that could be when collisions have happened, the level of severity that they are, maybe what the cost was, the length of time it took to get a vehicle back on the road, or was it a total loss and therefore a new vehicle had to be purchased? And of course, what was the impact on the individuals? So were they injured in the crash, and was this their first crash? So is this an individual who had crashed multiple times while working for the company, or if not, it was their first one, then again, what actions do we need to take? And try and look a little bit forensically into that to see what happened. Now, again, we're all super busy. We've all got, you know, many different pulls on our time, and often doing that analysis on that data can be something that is hard to find the time to do if it's not set up in the right way. So one way that data can be collected is, I mentioned at the top of the call, the Mentor app. So within the Mentor app. So that's an app that does telematics and is able to monitor a driver while they drive, but also become a companion for the driver with emergency response capability and so on. Within the app, we also have driver event reporting. Now, obviously, there are various other ways that drivers can report collisions. We find that having it on the phone, on the basis that most people have their phone with them, is a good way to get that data in. You may find that, again, lease companies or insurers would have apps on the phone that could be used for this. But in this instance, I'm talking about our app Mentor, which enables drivers to put the relevant information in after a crash and even take pictures and be able to submit that to wherever it is within the client that's required. And that may also include, for example, making a copy to an insurer, a broker, a leasing company. And the key thing here really is increasing the speed at which that data is collected and the way that it's then stored. So if for example, all crash data, or 90% or whatever, is coming in via the same tool, be that Mentor or another driver event report tooling, it means that it's all in one place, and you could personalize a form, and you could, have the right fields in there and enable you to manage that data more efficiently. Also enables the vehicle management sort of process to get started faster. So as you can see at the bottom there, considerable savings in insurance claims in the event that the process is kicked off pretty quickly. And this is one of the tools that can help to do that. It also informs on, as I mentioned before, what exactly has happened and how can we try and reduce the likelihood of it happening in the future. So I mentioned pulling together all the data and the importance of doing that. So Virtual Risk Manager is our tool for that. Again, having some sort of dashboard is super important, I would argue. You saw on the second slide this sort of funnel of data that you often have to deal with, and you may have noticed that the Excel symbol in there. We still are heavily reliant on spreadsheets, of course, but they are not particularly easy to share with multiple stakeholders, not that easy to analyze if there are lots of data fields. And again, seeing things in a visual way can often enable better actions, whereas if it's just line after line of Excel spreadsheet, that's not always the most engaging way. So with a dashboard like VRM, you're able to get Tableau powered insights on the collision data to really be able to see, okay, how many crashes are we having? What's the situation with the way that we are, dealing with these crashes? Is the number going up or down over a period? You could perhaps review, okay, same period of the year last year, what was the situation, etc., etc. So I think being able to see this in a clear and easy way, access it across an organization, and be able to export reports to leadership or committees, wherever that may be, can make a huge difference. And the final point that I wanted to raise, what is around professional coaching. So again, this is part of our proposition, but there are, plenty of other places that you can access this, but it's super important to collect the data for sure, but we can't forget the human factor here. So being in a car crash can be a really stressful and difficult thing for anybody to be part of, particularly if it's at work and they are, concerned about their job or whatever it might be. So with professional coaching, it's possible to sit down with a driver and really understand what were the failures in defensive driving techniques and how has that contributed to the crash or the incident. And that might even be in the instance where the driver wasn't at fault. So somebody has gone into the back of them, someone's hit them at a junction, but we often say at eDriving, there's no such thing as an accident. 94% of collisions being seen to be human error related. That human error is always a little bit tricky to distribute, but I think there's often something that could have been done, even if somebody's crashed into you, that you could have done differently to maybe minimize that risk. So being able to help that person to understand the risks they face, the risks they pose and help to bring that down can make a huge difference. So collecting the data, super important. Helping the individual off the back of the collision, again, important. And being able to put everything in one place so that it's easy for everybody to see, easy for people to understand, and can be shared across the organization, again, can really go towards what we hold dear, which is trying to create that crash-free culture. Because really, the collection of data, the collection of information after a collision, the main objective should be, how can we try to avoid this happening in the future? So thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to answering some questions later on in the session. Thanks again.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Lemaire. I'm Head of Crime and Regulatory at Arch Law. I provide representation to drivers following serious and fatal collisions, and also I'm there to protect the company in the event of any collisions or any health and safety prosecutions. So I'll just flip to the next slide, and I just want you to have a think. Picture this scenario. You're either a driver, or you're a transport manager, or you're a manager within a fleet company. And by that, I mean, it doesn't have to be trucks, it could be vans, company cars, grey fleet, anything like that. So either picture yourself as the driver, or picture yourself as getting a phone call. This was actually a real life case, and names have been changed to protect identities. So the driver, Mr. Eric Smith, has been involved in a fatal collision on the A234 heading towards Culverhouse Cross interchange. It's about 7:30 on the 11th of May. He was driving a 44-ton articulated lorry, so one of the biggies, en route to a delivery. The deceased, Mr. Curtis Jackson, was driver of a Vauxhall Golf that came to a stop in a line of traffic. Unfortunately, Mr. Smith didn't stop in time, and he collided with the rear of Mr. Jackson's Golf. And the force of that shunted Mr. Jackson's vehicle into the rear of a Porsche being driven by Marion Knight. And unfortunately, Ms. Knight suffered life-changing injuries. So at this stage, as is normal, we have no information. Nobody really knows what's happened, including the police and the driver who's been involved. Nobody really knows who's to blame, why that car came to a stop, if it stopped suddenly. Whether potentially there's even any defence available to Mr. Smith at this point. So Mr. Smith phones his manager, panicking. Matter of minutes before that phone is confiscated by the police and before they turn up at the scene. Afterwards, he wouldn't be contactable. The company, you, have no way of liaising with the police or getting any control over the scenario. Or if you're thinking you're Mr. Smith, even in your personal lives or driving for work, how do you get through to anyone who might be able to help you? Mr. Smith, of course, is about to be arrested on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving, which carries a custodial sentence if he's convicted. And he's about to be questioned at the scene and at the roadside. And I just want you to really think, what do you do in that scenario? We've all heard at murder scenes of the golden hour. Road traffic collisions, it's the golden minutes. You have minutes to react to provide protection to that driver. A driver takes minutes or seconds to incriminate themselves at the scene. What are the two things, the only two things that a driver should be telling the police at the scene? Well, that's their name. That is a legal requirement. And the vehicle that they're driving, that's a legal requirement. Thereafter, absolutely nothing until they've spoken to a lawyer and had advice. That might seem counterintuitive because, of course, if we haven't been in and out of the criminal justice system, we're not au fait with the fact that we wouldn't speak to a police or somebody that asks us a question. That's the polite thing to do. But unfortunately, the moment that you do that, you potentially incriminate yourselves. Drivers are very suggestible at the scene. They've just been trying to go to work that day. They haven't been trying to do anything in terms of committing a criminal offence. And make no mistake, the scene of a road traffic collision is a live police investigation from the moment they arrive at the scene. They're vulnerable. They're open to suggestions. The police know exactly what they're doing. They might provide explanations to the driver as to why it might have happened. Well, maybe you were tired. They're being very nice to the driver at that point. The driver says, oh yeah, that might have been it. The baby was up all night, thinking that that provides them with some kind of excuse or defence. Of course, that just gets them straight into the territory of dangerous driving. What do you advise your drivers? What do you as a driver, what have you been advised? Does everybody within a company know the process or what should happen? There should be immediate representation to drivers at the scene. Within minutes, a driver should be calling a 24/7 criminal legal assistance line that gets them through to a lawyer so that they can have advice and they can tell them where they are so a lawyer can be dispatched to that police station that they're going to. I just want to point out something really crucial. I stand in front of a lot of companies and a lot of drivers and they say, oh, we covered on that. We've got that through our insurance. We've got 24/7 cover. I'd like you just to do a deep dive on that. FNOL, or First Notification of Loss, or insurer helplines are not the same thing. They're not criminal legal assistance. They may offer you a hire car, which isn't going to be much good to you in that scenario. They may talk about insurance claims, not much good to you. There needs to be immediate crisis response. And it's something that not a lot of companies think about until either it's happened to them or it's too late. If you don't have access to a lawyer straight away, it leaves the drivers in a vulnerable position. But make no mistake, it leaves the company and senior officials within the company at significant risk because they have no control over what a driver's saying, what might be happening at the scene, the vehicle's impounded, driver's phone's gone, brand and reputational issues. Talked about some of the consequences. Driver speaks at the scene, guesses, speculates, incriminates themselves. So we said no way of contacting them. Driver knowingly or unknowingly incriminates the company, might talk about defect issues, might talk about being tired and that the transport manager knew they were tired, might talk about doing a significant number of hours. As I've said, there's no control in terms of the police investigation. I don't know if anyone's ever tried getting information out of the police if you're not representing or if you don't have a representative in there with the driver. The police will just say, live police investigation, no information. Difficult to control the messaging because what's the first thing that happens? That brand, a company's brand, is straight in social media, straight on the news. I often talk about cost as one of the last things because, of course, for me, it's the human side of things, the moral obligation to provide protection to drivers at the scene to make sure that their well-being is looked after. But actually, what cost implications does that have in terms of what the driver's saying? Might that make it difficult to defend any claim that will inevitably follow a criminal case? It's absolutely no exaggeration to say that what's said and done at the scene has a huge effect on the overall outcome. Put simply, cases are won and lost at the roadside. So just to go back, because you might be wondering what happened to Mr. Smith and the company. So his transport manager didn't know what to do. There wasn't a process in place. There wasn't a crisis response process that was seamless. And those golden minutes I talked about were lost. He spoke at the scene, saying he didn't see the cars ahead. I mean, whether that would be right. In fact, we discovered later, looking at the collision investigation reports and expert evidence, that wasn't in fact right, but that's what he said at the scene. And he agreed to the suggestion he was tired. The police asked if his boss knew and he said they were close friends and he told him he'd been having trouble sleeping. What does that do? The director and the health and safety manager were also questioned by the police and the HSE, treated to a joint interview. Mr. Smith unfortunately wasn't represented until a third interview, some months down the line, which can often be the case. Expert evidence in fact showed that the vehicles ahead had stopped suddenly and that Mr. Smith may not have had very long to react in actual fact. So potentially there, I'm not saying it would have got him off every criminal offence, but we could maybe have got it down to a causing death by careless driving, which has very different potential outcomes to the offence he was actually charged with, which was causing death by dangerous driving, of course, because of the tiredness admissions. So his comments convicted him, but they also convicted the directors and the company under the Health and Safety at Work Act. The insurers ended up paying out a significant sum of money in claims, lost the chance of contributory negligence, and of course then, as we talked about, cost right at the end, company premiums ended up going up. Just a live example to show you how stumbling at the beginning of a process affects it right at the end of the process. So how should it look? This is how the clock should look in terms of a police attended collision. And it doesn't have to be fatal. It can just be injury, any blue light attended collision. The collision occurs. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that any driver should make a phone call to a crisis response line without first, of course, getting out the human element, checking the injuries, checking to see if they can assist at the scene. Of course, that should happen. And phoning emergency services if they haven't already been phoned by passers-by. But thereafter, there should be a 24/7 crisis response directly through to a criminal lawyer, not through to an insurer, not through to a broker, through to a criminal lawyer, because otherwise vital minutes are lost. And that's the support the criminal lawyer should then give to the driver. Some companies like a transport manager to call that number if they run a 24/7 operation, and that's absolutely fine too. So as long as a call is made and a lawyer is dispatched to the police station, to the scene, and initial advice given to the driver, that's how it should look. Of course, then, the process will be in place where the lawyer will inform all the necessary parties, so the company if they don't already know, and that gives the company a vital window in. And of course, to insurers, brokers, all the necessary people in the piece, completes the puzzle. And at that point, the solicitor controls all communication with the police and with the company. And of course, companies then protected, as is the driver, with solicitor-client privilege. Because if that investigation isn't carried out with a solicitor and the companies do their own investigation, that documentation can be seized. I just want to make a point about data in terms of data that companies gather. And companies often say to me, well, we've got cameras and we've got telematics and tracking data and things like that track speed. And what I say is that that's fantastic, but just be careful about the pitfalls of that. Because if somebody within the company isn't reviewing that and isn't looking at the information that they're getting from that, so we're talking about near misses, we're not always talking about collisions, speeding infringements, episodes of dangerous driving that haven't actually resulted in any collision, but are there for the company to see, then if something does happen with that same driver, that data can convict individuals within the company and the company themselves, because ignorance isn't a defence. A company will be deemed to have knowledge of that if it's being sent back to the company. So just make sure that you're looking at your data, you're tracking it, and that you're implementing processes, procedures, policies as a result of what that data is telling you. It's just a really important point that I think companies need to be aware of. Don't just gather things, you need to act on them. So that's how the clock should look. If it doesn't look like that, you need to look at how you make it look like that. Because as we discussed, the consequences are just absolutely huge. So there are no losers in providing representation to drivers, in providing crisis response and having proper processes. Of course, it benefits the driver. Potentially they have a defence, they have somebody to turn to, they're supported. They're not incriminating themselves needlessly. Helps the company. It helps the senior managers within the company. Of course, it helps the broker and the insurer in terms of having a window in and potentially finding defences and maybe helping with costs at the end of it. Early information is key. Just putting it another way, how can you afford not to have that support in place for drivers when they need it the most? Thank you.
That concludes the presentation section of today's webinar. I wanted to say a huge thank you to our speakers today, Andrew Drury, Andrew Barrett-Clough and Charlotte Lemaire, for all their contributions to today's event. I'm pleased to say that Andrew Barrett-Clough from eDriving has joined us today for the question and answer session. So if any questions you would like to put to Andrew, please enter them on the chat function now. We're going to look at the results of today's poll question. At the start of this webinar, we asked you what kinds of incidents give us the most useful data to improve fleet safety in the future. It's good to see that misses is one of the most common answers appearing on there, given some of the content in Andrew Drury's presentation earlier about using data from post-crash investigations and how near misses can sometimes give us possibly the most useful information to look at in the future in terms of identifying trends and room for further development. Andrew, you spoke a lot about the turn of technology for monitoring crash data. What kind of capability does this sort of technology have for analysing and learning from near misses and other incidents that might not be a crash or a collision?
Yeah, hi everyone. So, I mean, learning from near misses from technology is a difficult one, right? Particularly from a telematics perspective. I suppose you could look at things like the number of harsh braking incidents and try to investigate those, but I think being able to read whether it was a true near miss or not purely from a telematics app, to my knowledge, is not something that's necessarily done all that much. I suppose things like camera technology is perhaps something that could be reviewed. We have a proposition within our group called Smart Drive, where the video footage is reviewed by real humans, and therefore you could absolutely look to identify near miss data through that. And again, I suppose depending on the nature of it and the regularity of it, that could give rise to the need for coaching or additional training, as I mentioned.
Okay, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any further questions from the audience from today's webinar. So unless there's anything anyone particularly wants to ask, I think we're well suited to wrap things up for today. So thank you all for your time today and joining us today. And again, thank you to today's speakers for their presentations and assistance with it. We hope you found today's content informative and engaging. If you'd like to continue any more of the conversations that we've had today, you can do so on the Global Fleet Champions LinkedIn page, on our Twitter. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, the recording of today's event will be made public on the Fleet Champions website and on our Break YouTube channel in the coming days. If you're interested in attending any of our future webinars, our next one will be focusing on planning journeys to share the road with a particular focus on vulnerable road users and plotting journeys to avoid them and minimise the danger they face. That will be taking place on Tuesday, July 26th. Thank you for your time. The webinar will now conclude.